Afternoon. Assalamu alaikum wa masal khair. Thank you to the ERF and Arab Fund for inviting me here to speak about GCC Currency Union and its precursors and prospects. It's okay.
That's mine.
Yeah, that one. So if you go to this one,
Yes,
yeah, this one.
Okay.
It's okay.
It is, that's how this
So in this brief presentation, I'll skim over the rationale and the merits of a currency union for the region. I'll also discuss the progress and setbacks to date, as well as assessing the extent to which convergence has occurred amongst the GCC economies on the basis of their own criteria, which are similar to those of Maastricht in Europe. I'll also examine the institutional precursors that are necessary for achieving the stated goal of deeper economic integration in the region. And finally, I'll conclude by looking at the prospects for the project. As the current governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, said just last year, a successful and sustainable single currency requires some ceding of national sovereignty, which involves considerations beyond mere economics. Any decision then to forge ahead with monetary union will be as much based on a desire for greater political integration as much as economic integration. At this juncture, I think it's fair to say that the likelihood of a formal Euro-style currency union coming into being in the Gulf is unlikely. Nevertheless, I will conclude by pointing out that there are other less demanding, possibly monetary integration options on the table, such as a parallel currency, which could conceivably have some benefits and be seen as a transitional stepping stone towards deeper integration. I'll briefly discuss the rationale and benefits for a GCC currency union, those which are most significant to the bloc, as opposed to talking generally about the rationale and benefits for currency union. Optimal currency areas can only manifest within a single market where labour and capital are mobile and where fiscal budgetary decisions and banking operations are accountable, transparent and subject to inter-regional institutional regulation and oversight. Thus, in taking steps towards a currency union, the GCC countries would first need to complete a fully functioning single market in goods and services and devolve, when required, some executive decision-making powers in relation to monetary and macroeconomic matters. By doing so, they would create a larger and deeper market that would be considerably more attractive to domestic and foreign investors alike, as well as increasing their collective bargaining power. And there is also potential for capital market deepening and development, for example, the issuance of a Gulf Dinar denominated sovereign bonds. As well as the economic merits of the project, it's arguable that it is the preparation measures themselves, such as improving accountability, increasing institutional soundness, having more transparent and greater dissemination of economic data, that are likely to constitute some of the key economic benefits. In 2001, the GCC leaders agreed to a new economic agreement in which they set out a number of steps towards deeper integration. And it's worthwhile briefly just talking about the progress and the setbacks to date. In 2003, after several years of negotiation, a customs union was inaugurated, unifying external tariffs at 5% for the bloc. However, subsequent to that, in 2004, a blow was dealt to the customs union when Bahrain decided to go it alone and sign a bilateral free trade agreement with the US. Later in 2006, Oman also followed this, possibly creating the problem of trade diversion once again. And according to Saudi Arabia's official statements at the time, going against the spirit of the customs union. In 2003, all the GCC currencies were pegged to the US dollar, and this meant that Kuwait had to move away from its basket peg, and it did so ostensibly to stabilize intra-GCC exchange rates in the lead up to monetary union. Yet in 2007, a few years later, Kuwait decided to revert back to its basket peg, citing the need to tackle imported inflation through a gradual currency revaluation. Whilst Kuwait's undisclosed basket of currencies undoubtedly contains a heavy dollar component, and Kuwait has officially said it can easily move back to a dollar peg at any time should it need to, nevertheless, I think this illustrates a possible divergence in the preference for the choice of the external exchange rate. And this is a very important decision that, of course, will have to be negotiated at some point in the future. Further misgivings about the currency union project were voiced by Oman in 2006 when it announced it would be leaving the project because of a lack of progress. Nevertheless, in 2008, it was announced that a common market had come into force. However, in the absence of economic policy coordinations, it's been reported that factors of production are still hampered by issues such as differences in regulation in terms of foreign investment, as well as real estate ownership, different corporate accounting systems, and different implementation or lack of uniformity of implementation in some regulations. In 2010, the Gulf Monetary Council was established in Riyadh. It's the precursor to the central bank. Riyadh is also the location for the only other intra-GCC institution, which is the GCC Secretariat. And this announcement was much to the dismay of the UAE, which had previously stated that it wished to host the location of the central bank. And not long after this announcement, the UAE said that it would also leave the monetary union project. And this undoubtedly dealt a major blow to the credibility of the currency union, given that the UAE is the second largest economy in the bloc. It's one of the most diversified and open, and it also constitutes about a quarter of the bloc's total GDP. In 2005, the GCC leaders agreed to convergence criteria targets that were broadly similar to those of Europe's Maastricht criteria, but with some tweaking towards the unique economic characteristics of the region. These were targets, though, and not entrance criteria, as was ostensibly the case in EMU. The necessity of nominal convergence criteria to monetary union has been questioned by some economists. Nevertheless, I am going to briefly review the targets and the extent to which convergence has been achieved for three reasons. Firstly, these are the targets that have been agreed upon by the GCC leaders in 2005. Secondly, because as of 2015, achieving these is still among the stated objectives of the Gulf Monetary Council. And thirdly, because any meaningful assessment of convergence, nominal or otherwise, really illustrates the need to have collation and standardization of timely data by a pan-GCC statistical organization, something that's not been fully addressed to date. So, given their fixed exchange rate regimes, the GCC leaders agreed to a convergence target for official reserves to be equal to or more than 4 months of imports. As we can see from the data presented here over the period of time, GCC reserves for the most part have been above this level, with the exception on occasions of Bahrain and the UAE. Having said that, again, it's a problem of issues with data that, for example, Saudi Arabia's official data includes the sovereign wealth fund data because the central bank also acts as a sovereign wealth fund, whereas in the case of the UAE, we're not including the sovereign wealth fund reserves here. So you can see that the UAE has breached this criteria over the last few years. The UAE is a major re-export center now for the Middle East and a trading hub, and it's possible that that's why it hasn't been meeting the criteria. Nevertheless, all the GCC states have been able to maintain fixed exchange rates over a number of decades now without facing any problems. Again, due to the fixed exchange rates against the effective exchange rates pegs to the US dollar in the region, the GCC interest rates have had to reflect those of the US Federal Reserve, albeit with some lags. And as a result of that, there is considerable convergence in interest rates in the region. The interest rate spread widened prior to the financial crisis, but has come down considerably now to about 1%. Given the fact that the GCC exchange rate policies have effectively superseded monetary policy autonomy in the region, it's often assumed that the costs of a single currency will be minimal for them. Having said that, as we can see here, at times inflation rates have diverged considerably in the region. Just looking over this short period, we can see there has been very large divergence at times. Prior to the financial crisis, there was double-digit inflation in the UAE and in Qatar at considerable cost to those economies. And, the inflation divergence at that time was as much as 10%. Coming, more recently, the inflation has cooled down across the bloc as a result of, the recessions following the financial crisis. So today, all of the states are actually meeting that particular inflation criteria. The fiscal targets shown here, which are broadly those of the Maastricht criteria, which were then enshrined in the Stability and Growth Pact in Europe, these criteria were designed to prevent undisciplined spenders from free riding on the credibility of more fiscally prudent states. And the deficit to GDP ratio and the debt to GDP ratios were considered to be critical for the sustainability of monetary union in Europe. And as we can see from the recent experience of EMU, unsound fiscal policies in some states have posed a major challenge to the continuation of the monetary union and its sustainability. In the period of analysis presented here, we can see that most of the GCC states have met the criteria, with the exception of Bahrain in terms of fiscal deficit breaches, and Saudi Arabia at the end of the 1990s, when oil prices were extremely low, had built up considerable debt levels as well. But the fact that most of these fiscal criteria are being met over this period of analysis is perhaps not surprising, given the very large oil revenue windfalls that we have seen over the period, over the past decade. Having said this, in the period ahead, most forecasts are for oil prices to be weaker, and as a result of global oversupply. And in fact, the IMF is also estimating that, or forecasting, sorry, that deficits and debt in the region will increase. In particular, Bahrain is expected to breach the 60% debt ratio in 2015, and by 2019, Bahrain's debt will reach 100% of its GDP, according to IMF forecasts. So more testing times ahead. Certainly, given the pro-cyclical nature of budgets in the region, meeting these types of fiscal criteria, even with the slight tweaking towards the oil price, is nevertheless probably going to be challenging in the medium to long run. Overall, in terms of track record, we can observe that the post-financial crisis, there were breaches, rose rapidly, but have subsequently fallen quite considerably. In 2009, half the economies were breaching the deficit criteria as a result of recessions following the financial crisis in some countries. And also there was still considerable inflation divergence at that time as well. In 2013, we saw only 2 breaches of the criteria according to available data. That was Bahrain's deficit ratio and the UAE's reserve criteria. Overall, I think, broadly speaking, the convergence criteria to a large extent have been met, but the size of the oil rent has been a determining factor in this. Whilst the relevance of pre-union convergence pre-union convergence to post-union economic performance is open to question by some economists, the importance of providing timely, consistent and standardized data sets across the GCC and for the bloc as a whole cannot be underestimated. And that leads me on to talk about the precursors, prospects and the option of a parallel currency for the bloc. Intra-regional institutions, as we've been talking about today, are critical to the process, critical to many macroeconomic policy implementation, but also critical to the process of establishing and sustaining monetary union, in that they can strengthen the cohesion of a currency union, ensure its credibility, and provide third-party enforcement or oversight. Whilst the Gulf Monetary Council has been established in 2010 in Riyadh and is slated to be preparing the way for the establishment of the central bank, the current and future role to be played by the institution has been questioned by some key regional players. For example, the UAE Central Bank Governor Sultan bin Nasser Al Suwaidi said that the institution's role is limited to conducting studies, whilst it was supposed to play a key role in monetary policy. Indeed, there are a number of critical outstanding issues regarding the future monetary institution to be negotiated and agreed upon in advance, such as and this is not an exhaustive list by any means, the mandate, the organizational structure, the voting structure of a future monetary policy committee. Will it be one country, one vote as per EMU, or on the basis of economic mass? What will be the seniorage distribution, and to which GCC body will it be accountable to? Concerns by some GCC states over the concentration of pan-GCC institutions in Riyadh, and therefore possible dominance of these institutions by Saudi Arabia, could, for example, be allayed if some progress was to be made on these outstanding issues. Furthermore, the creation of a Eurostat equivalent to be tasked with collecting and harmonizing data for the GCC has been a long-standing recommended step towards greater integration in the region. Some of our colleagues here from the IMF were recommending the creation of Gulfstat since 2006. An embryonic Gulfstat has recently been established in Oman, but it's not possible at this stage to verify its mission or vision. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that common scrutiny over national accounts, and in particular fiscal budgets, may be considered by some ruling elites to be an unwelcome intrusion into sovereign matters. If currency union cannot be optimal in lieu of a single market and a general acceptance of the need for greater fiscal and macroeconomic policy coordination, then the decision to forge ahead must be based upon what sort of socio-economic landscape do the GCC leaders envisage for their countries in the coming decades. A successful and at present, currency union, EMU style, does not appear to be a short-term prospect. A successful and sustainable single currency requires some ceding of national sovereignty. It's well documented that EMU was driven by political motivations, and therefore it received the necessary political commitment. Setbacks to the GCC currency union appear to indicate that such political commitment is lacking. An optimal currency area can only become fully operational if we have a fully functioning common market, a general acceptance and actualization of deeper monetary policy coordination, and supporting institutions to provide necessary oversight and timely data. However, if the leaders in a number of GCC countries do see political as well as economic dividends from closer union and share similar economic visions, then it's possible that in the short to medium term, other monetary integration options might be on the table, such as a parallel currency. In 2006, Barry Eichengreen and others recommended the introduction of a parallel currency for the Southeast Asian economies that were hoping to integrate economically. And there are a number of relevant points for a parallel currency in the GCC region. Most importantly, that it could provide a step towards greater integration that would be driven by economics and not politics. A Gulf dinar could be created and allowed to circulate alongside national currencies. The market would dictate the extent of, dictate the pace of transition. Only when a critical number of producers and consumers had adopted the currency and using it as a medium of exchange would it be clear that the market and the behavior had adapted to the imperatives of a single currency. By issuing debt denominated in the parallel currency, governments could help to create benchmark assets and liquid secondary markets. They could encourage banks and firms to issue deposits in a Gulf currency unit, and also invest in the establishment of an efficient clearing and settlement system for the currency. Of course, establishing a parallel currency is not a risk or cost-free exercise in itself. Even if it were to increase inter-regional trade and investment and therefore heighten the attraction of using the currency, the inertia favouring the use of national currencies is going to be strong. Also, it would require prudential policies to limit the risks to financial stability that could be caused through currency mismatches. And that would also slow the adoption of the parallel currency, but nevertheless it might be argued that this is a preferable policy option in light of the slow progress made to date on a common currency. Such a parallel currency would still require increased coordination of policies and regulations. It would necessitate the collation of pan-GCC statistics for policy evaluation at the region level, and therefore it could still bring about these associated benefits from preparing. However, it would not require the systemic institutional reforms, the commitment and the level of political integration that forming a single currency involves, and therefore could be seen as a pragmatic stepping stone towards currency union if the political appetite for deeper integration materializes at some point in the future. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your comments and thoughts. Thank you.